is Kristen Gunther. I'm a graduate student in the program in ecology and the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. And what I'm interested in is science communication, and specifically how we can more effectively translate material that comes out of scientific literature into practice and management application in the field. So what we're really looking at is we're trying to develop these sort of communication techniques to help sort of producers and policymakers and researchers, different sort of interested groups that want to be communicate more effectively and more effectively transmit their material between those different sort of venues. So for this particular leg of the project, what we're looking at is the impact of negative versus positive language, so that kind of value-loaded language, and how it affects how people respond to technical information. So we had a couple different treatments. So we had a text that we put together about ecosystem uncertainty, with some technical information on the topic, and then we had people, we surveyed lots of producers, lots of policymakers, and some agency personnel. We came to field days last year and gave out the survey there, and attended some other things as well, so like SRM, Weed and Pest. And so we had this text on ecosystem uncertainty, and then depending on which version of you got, you might have gotten just the text, which was our control. You might have gotten the text with a very positively worded introduction, so words like opportunity, profit, possibility, sort of conveying this attitude of like positivity. Or you might have gotten sort of a negative introduction, so words like threat and risk, and you know, talking about things like invasive species. And so before you got that text, we asked you to rate 15 statements about ecosystem uncertainty, so on that topic. After you read the text, you re-rated the same 15 statements. And then about a month later, 1 to 2 months later, we contacted people, and they sort of re-rated those same 15 statements. And so basically what we were looking for is, does that sort of negative or positive introduction, that value-loaded language, affect how people pick up information out of that text? And it turns out that it does. And we saw some differences not only in our sort of positive versus negative introduction, but also that people responded differently to those treatments depending on their background in production or in policy, sort of in hands-on experience versus maybe less hands-on experience, and that's what we're up to. So these are sort of preliminary, but what I will say is we saw, so with non-producers, for example, with non-producers we saw that if you used a negative presentation, people really responded and believed the truth of the information in at least a couple of cases that we looked at. Whereas producers that were presented with either frame maybe didn't tend to move around their opinions, assess things more neutrally. We saw negative and positive responses diverge a few times, which was pretty cool. In general, one of the things you can take out of this is that value-loaded language does drive some response. So, you know, maybe using less value language, so like our control text was often different, right? So if you didn't have that sort of value-loaded language, people might tend more towards neutrality there. Yeah, so I think the major takeaway is probably at this point, since it's still pretty preliminary, is probably that value-based language can have an effect in driving people away from neutrality, and that, you know, it might make a difference based on their background. So you might respond to sort of that risk-based language different if you're a producer versus not a producer. Producers in general might be less likely to shift their opinion of a statement or of a concept because maybe they're a little bit more cautious to sort of alter their opinion and try out a new idea over time. So we're in the middle of this. So this is sort of our preliminary evidence that shows that people are shifting their opinions, their assessments based on value-based language. We're also doing a national version of the survey right now where we start incorporate images. And then ultimately, over the next year, I'm going to be working on developing a workshop curriculum to try to take some of this into practice and talk to people like extension educators or graduate students that are going to have to, at some point, be researchers who are communicating their results to the public and talk about why this stuff matters and how it could potentially, change how an audience responds to or picks up information they present depending on how they present it. I'm specifically really interested in looking at this sort of how people with different kinds of production backgrounds respond to the language. That obviously matters. For someone like an extension educator, you want to know if people pick up or don't pick up on sort of negative versus positive language. So yeah, we're building a workshop curriculum over the next year to try to take some of this into practice. So that, it's not necessarily as simple as positive language always has this effect or negative language always has this effect. One of the things that I think we're definitely seeing is that background matters a lot. And if you think about people who might be more hesitant, more thinking in terms of risk-based language, like a producer might be thinking in terms of risk-based language, that maybe they're going to respond to that language differently because they think about risk assessment all the time versus somebody that doesn't have to think as directly about risk in sort of an ecosystem or landscape level way. So I would say one of our big takeaways is that experience matters a lot when you're thinking about what language to use. And I look forward to sort of further parsing that and pursuing it in our national survey and seeing what we can find out in the data.